In this episode, we're going to make privacy assessments feel less like paperwork and more like a practical way of preventing harm, because beginners often imagine assessments as long documents that exist mainly to satisfy a checklist. A privacy impact assessment, PIA, is a structured method for thinking through how a project, system, or process could affect people's privacy before problems appear in the real world. Privacy-focused assessments can also include other formats and names, but the purpose is the same. Identify privacy risks early, choose safeguards that reduce those risks, and document the reasoning so the organization can act consistently. The challenge, and the reason Task 5 exists, is that assessments can look complete while still missing the impacts that matter most, especially when the assessment is written from a purely technical or purely legal viewpoint. Real-world impacts include the human side of surprise, confusion, unfair treatment, and loss of trust, not just whether data is encrypted or whether a notice exists. By learning how to perform PIAs and related assessments with a full picture of real-world effects, you gain a skill that helps keep privacy aligned with both rules and human experience. A useful way to understand assessments is to see them as decision tools rather than reports, because the best assessment is the one that changes design choices before launch. An assessment should help a team answer questions like what personal information is involved, why it is needed, what could go wrong, and what controls will keep people safe and respected. It should also clarify who is accountable for decisions and what evidence supports the choices. For beginners, it helps to remember that an assessment is not a promise that nothing bad will happen, because risk cannot be reduced to zero. Instead, it is a disciplined way to reduce the likelihood of harm and to reduce the severity of harm if something does go wrong. It also creates a record that shows the organization did not treat privacy as an afterthought, which matters when regulators, customers, or internal leaders ask how decisions were made. Before you can assess anything, you need a clear description of what is being assessed, because vague project descriptions are one of the biggest reasons real-world impacts get missed. If a team says they are building a new feature that improves the user experience, that tells you almost nothing about data collection, decision-making, or sharing. A solid assessment begins by describing the activity in plain language, including what the system does, who will use it, what data will be collected, and what decisions will be made based on that data. You also need to understand the context, such as whether the users are customers, employees, children, patients, or other groups with heightened expectations or vulnerabilities. Context changes the privacy risk even when the data looks similar, because people in different roles have different power, different choices, and different consequences if something goes wrong. When you define the scope clearly, you create a foundation for spotting impacts that would otherwise be hidden. Once scope is clear, the next step is mapping data flows in a way that captures reality rather than an idealized story. Data flow mapping is simply describing where data comes from, where it goes, who touches it, and how long it stays. But it must include both obvious paths and less obvious paths. Obvious paths include a user submitting a form and the system storing it, while less obvious paths include logs, analytics, backups, and customer support systems that copy data for troubleshooting. Another easy-to-miss flow is sharing between internal teams, because an organization can have many legitimate reasons to access data, but each new access increases the chance of misuse or mistake. Vendor involvement is also part of data flow reality, because a vendor may store or process the data in ways that create additional risks and additional legal obligations. If the data flow is incomplete, the assessment will likely be incomplete, no matter how well written the rest is. With the data flow understood, you can identify the kinds of personal information involved and why that matters. Some data is directly identifying, like names and contact details, while other data becomes identifying when combined, like device signals, location patterns, or unique account behaviors. Some data is sensitive because it reveals health, financial hardship, precise location, or other high-impact details, while other data becomes sensitive due to the context, such as employee performance information or student records. A frequent beginner mistake is to treat sensitivity as a fixed label rather than a relationship between data, context, and potential harm. For example, a purchase history might seem ordinary until it reveals religious items, medical supplies, or other deeply personal traits. An assessment should capture that possibility and consider what controls reduce the chance that ordinary data turns into a source of unexpected exposure. This is one of the points where real-world impacts can be missed if you only look at the data fields and not the human meaning behind them. Purpose and necessity are the next major assessment focus, because privacy is not only about protection but also about restraint. If a project collects data that is not necessary for the stated purpose, the assessment should treat that as a risk even if the organization plans to protect the data well. Excess collection creates more exposure, makes rights requests harder, and can lead to repurposing that surprises people. An assessment should ask whether the goal could be achieved with less data, fewer identifiers, shorter retention, or broader aggregation. It should also challenge purpose statements that are too broad, such as improving services, because broad purposes can justify almost anything and remove meaningful boundaries. When necessity is defined clearly, controls become easier to design because you know what must exist and what can be avoided. A privacy assessment that does not question necessity often becomes a document that normalizes overcollection and then tries to patch the risk with security controls alone. Now you move into identifying risks, and here the biggest trap is defining risk too narrowly. Many assessments focus on unauthorized access and data breaches, which are important, but privacy risk also includes misuse by authorized users, unfair outcomes from automated decisions, and confusing experiences that lead people to share more than they intend. Privacy risk includes the risk of losing control over personal information through excessive sharing, unclear choices, or default settings that favor the organization. It also includes the risk of function creep, where data collected for one purpose slowly becomes used for others without clear review or updated notice. Another category is harm from inaccuracies, where wrong data leads to wrong decisions, and the person may not even know why an outcome occurred. Real-world impacts can also include emotional harm, embarrassment, discrimination, or chilling effects where people avoid using a service because they feel watched. A strong assessment names these kinds of risks in plain language so the project team can take them seriously. To avoid missing real-world impacts, you need to think from the data subject's perspective, because a person experiences privacy through surprise and power dynamics, not through internal policy documents. Ask what the person expects at the moment data is collected and whether the actual use would feel consistent with that expectation. Ask what choices the person has, and whether those choices are meaningful or merely decorative. Ask how the person would be affected if their information were exposed, misused, or used to make a decision about them without explanation. Ask whether some groups would be affected more than others, such as people with less technical literacy, people with fewer alternatives, or people whose identities make certain data particularly sensitive. When you put yourself in that perspective, you often see impacts that a purely technical review would miss, like a design that encourages oversharing or a default that quietly enables broad tracking. This perspective also helps teams understand that privacy is not an internal preference. It is part of the user experience. Safeguards are where the assessment becomes actionable, and safeguards must match the risks you identified rather than being generic. If the risk is excessive sharing, the safeguard might be limiting who can access the data and documenting approvals for new sharing. If the risk is surprise, the safeguard might be clearer notice at the right moment and better default settings that reduce tracking unless the person opts in. If the risk is sensitive inference, the safeguard might be limiting certain analytics or separating identifiers from behavioral data. If the risk is unfair automated decisions, safeguards might include human review for certain outcomes, explainability measures, and a way for people to challenge decisions. Safeguards include technical controls and operational controls, but the key is that they should be specific enough that someone can implement them without guessing. A well-run assessment results in concrete requirements that are tracked to completion, not just a set of suggestions that disappear after approval. A major reason assessments miss impacts is that they treat risk as static, but privacy risk changes over time as data accumulates and systems evolve. A feature that collects minimal data at launch can become riskier as the data volume grows and new uses appear. A vendor relationship can change when the vendor adds subprocessors or changes its practices. A system that was used by a small group can become widely used, increasing the consequences of failure. Assessments should therefore include a life cycle view, asking how long data will be kept, how it will be deleted, and what happens when the purpose ends. They should also consider change triggers, such as a new data element, a new integration, or a new use case that should prompt a reassessment. Thinking this way helps you avoid a common failure where an assessment is completed once and then treated as permanently valid, even as reality changes around it. Evaluation and documentation are the final elements that turn an assessment into something trustworthy, because without evidence and follow-through, the assessment becomes a story rather than a control. Documentation should capture the project description, data flows, identified risks, chosen safeguards, and the reasoning behind decisions, including any accepted residual risk. It should also record who approved key decisions and what conditions were attached, such as completing a control before launch or limiting a use until new consent is obtained. Evaluation means checking whether safeguards actually exist and operate as intended, which can include reviewing design decisions, confirming process steps, and checking that retention and access controls are configured and used. A mature approach also includes learning, where incidents, complaints, and audit findings feed back into improved assessment questions and better safeguards. Even for beginners, the key takeaway is that an assessment is only as good as its implementation and its ability to influence real behavior. As we close, keep in mind that the purpose of PIAs and privacy-focused assessments is to prevent preventable harm by forcing a project to confront privacy reality before the public does. You start with clear scope and realistic data flows, because you cannot protect what you do not understand. You examine data types, sensitivity, purpose, and necessity, because overcollection and vague purposes create long-term risk. You identify risks broadly, including breach risk, misuse risk, unfairness risk, surprise risk, and trust risk, because privacy is experienced by humans in context. You choose safeguards that match those risks and you plan for change over time, so the assessment remains meaningful as systems evolve. Task 5 matters because it trains you to be the person who notices what others miss and who can translate privacy principles into practical requirements that reduce harm while keeping the organization's goals honest and defensible.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.